Hello everyone. So in the previous video we started working on dice roll event, and as a result we created many functions. Now in this video we will start working on piece selection event, that is when the user selects a piece either from home or from any of the cell box. So we will create this function in the game component just as we created on the dice roll, and we will pass this function as a prop to both the horizontal cells container and vertical cells container as well as the playbox component, because we will be passing this function to the cell box component, so we will have to pass it to both the horizontal cells container and vertical cells container as well as the playbox. So let's get started. Now let's create this function on piece selection. And let's pass it to the player box component. And we will call this function only if it's player's turn. Now let's pull this function from the props and call this function on press. Passing it the piece. As you can see, when I click on 1, you can see the name 1, 2, name of the piece 2, 3, and 4. So this function will only be called if the player whose turn it is to roll the dice presses on any of the pieces. So therefore, if any other player clicks on his pieces, this function will not be called. When the game starts, the game is waiting for the first player to roll the dice. After the player rolls the dice, and in case the player has option to select any of his pieces to move, the state of the game changes and is now waiting for the player to select any of the pieces. So there are basically two states. Either the game is waiting for the player to roll the dice, or waiting for the player to select any of the pieces. So let's create a Boolean variable in the state is waiting for dice roll. And initialize. And the initial value is going to be true. And in this function, we will check if it's true. So if this is true and the user selects any of the pieces, nothing will be done on piece selection and this function will return. But if this is not true, we will do the following. Let's pull the player object along with its pieces from the state, as well as the moves. So there are two conditions when this function is called. Either we have a single move in the moves array, or we have more than one. In this case, we will just call the function this.move piece by position, passing the selected piece and then move. But before we call this function, let's check for a possibility. If so in this case, we will just return. Because when the piece position is home, we need to have a move of 6 in order to make a move. Now in this condition, if we have more than one moves, there are two more conditions. Either the player has selected a piece from home, or the player has selected any of the pieces from any of the cell box. So let's see what can be done if the user selects the piece from home. So if the selected piece has position home, we will just consume the move and update the position of selected piece like this. So if it's a red piece, the new position is going to be R1. And let's also update the update time. And update the state. And after the state is updated, after updating the state, for the remaining moves, there are two conditions. So if the player does not have option for moves, that is, if we will just call the function this.move piece by position with the remaining move that we have. Else, if this is not true, that is, the player has options for move. Suppose the player has one of its pieces at this position, R1, and one piece at this position, R9, and we have one move in moves array. So the player can either pick R1 to move or pick the piece at position R9 to move. So in this condition, the player has options for move. So the game should allow the player to choose either to move piece at position R1 or select the piece at position R9. But there is one more condition that can happen. That is, if the player has all of the active pieces positioned at the same position. So if the player has all of the pieces at position R9 and we have one move left, after updating the state, the game can make move for any of the active piece on behalf of the player, like this. Let's define the condition for is active piece. Let's define an array of active pieces. And every piece that is active, we will add to the array of active pieces. And now we will check if the position is same for all active pieces, like this. So this is going to be true if all of the active pieces are at the same position. And in that case, we will call this function this dot move, and now let's work on this condition, and that is the player has selected a piece which is not at home. So in this case we need the game to show a dialog box to the player that shows the options for move. So when this option is pressed, we will call a function on move selected with the option. So option 2 is going to be if moves.length is greater than 1, otherwise it's going to be undefined, and we will add it to the move options. And the same for option 3. And we will call the alert from React Native. Now let's create this function on move selected. And we will first check if this move is even possible. Otherwise, we will just show a message move not possible. Now let's create this function is move possible for position. And we can copy and paste from an existing function. And we just need to execute this code for the move that is passed to this function, instead of iterating over the moves array from state. But if the move is possible, we will call the function move but we also need to remove the move from the moves array. Alright, and we are done with this function on piece selection. Let's update some functions where we need to update this field is waiting for dice roll. So let's update get next turn. So whenever this function is called get next turn, we should update the state is waiting for dice roll to true. And in this function on dice roll, in this condition, let's set this to false, is waiting for dice roll. Because in this condition, if the dice number is not 6, we are calling the function update player pieces. Now let's find a way to test all these functions that we have been coding so far. As a developer, you should always be trying to find out a shortcut way to test your functionality for a specific scenario. So for example, if I want to test a scenario where the red player has a piece at this position R1 and the yellow player's piece is at this position R2, and it's red player's turn and red player gets a 1. So in this case, the position of the piece of red player will be updated to R2 and the position of yellow piece will get updated to home. Similarly, if the yellow piece is at this position R9 and the red piece is at position R8, and also in this case it's a red player's turn and the red player gets a 1. So in this case, the position of red piece will get updated to R9, but the yellow piece will remain at this position beneath the red piece without updating its position. So for testing all of these various scenarios, we need to find out a way. So let's work on this. So each time when we click on the dice, we are generating a random number. So for testing specific scenarios, we need to have a specific test data for that scenario instead of generating random numbers. So let's update the state with some fields. dice roll test data. It's going to be an array of numbers. And to use this dice roll test data, let's define a field dice roll test data index. Initialize it to 0. So when the function get random int is called, for testing, we will comment these two lines. First, let's pull those two fields from the state. And when this function is called onDiceRoll, we will increment the index for the test data. Let's save this and let's test it. So first time as you can see, instead of generating random numbers, it is getting the numbers from the dice roll test data. We will also create some test functions that we will be using to create our desired scenario. But before working on that, we need to complete the cellbox component. It looks like this condition is not updating the state back to 0. The problem is that although we are updating the state in this function, the statement where we are calling this function. Now this statement itself is updating the state, and it is updating the dice roll test data index back to this. This is incrementing. So inside this function, this statement is being overridden by the statement where we are calling this function. So let's modify this code. Instead of updating the index in this function, let's just return. And over here, we will define a variable updated dice roll test data index equals to +1. But if updated dice roll test data index, if this is greater than or equals to dice roll test data dot length, we will update it to 0. And instead of this, we will use the variable updated. Now let's test it. Now if you notice, after getting 6 and 1, we are stuck on this yellow player. No matter how many times we click on this one, the player is still on yellow. Although the dice number is getting changed, but the player gets stuck on the yellow. That's because when the dice number is 6, we are inside this condition. And since the length is not equals to 3, this condition is not executed and the control goes to this condition. So this just updates the moves without switching the player turn. And therefore after that, when we click the dice, the control gets into this condition because the next time the dice number is not equals to 6, and hence in the function update player pieces. In this function, the control gets into this condition. In this condition, the player is not finished is true. Inside this condition, this function player has option for moves returns true because the player has option to select any of the 4 pieces to move out of home. And so therefore, we update the state with animate for selection equals to true. So now we need to use this variable animate for selection inside the function on dice roll. First, we need to check animate for selection. If this is true, animate for selection, this function will return because the player needs to select any of the pieces to move. And if the player presses on dice while this is true, this code should not be executed and this function should return. This is the same kind of condition that we had in the function on piece selection, where we first checked if it's waiting for dice roll, this will return. So for this event on piece selection, we are checking if it's waiting for dice roll, it will return. Well, actually this should be pulling the player object from the state. So this should be like this. Now let's pass this animate for selection state field to the player box component so that we can use it to show some kind of animation on the pieces that will indicate to the user that the user needs to select any of the pieces for the move. So let's copy, and in the player box component, we also need to pass this condition so that only the pieces of the relevant player gets animated. And we also need to check if the player has 6 in moves. So let's define this over here. Because the player can only move these pieces if the player has 6 in the moves. Now let's go to the player box component and let's pull this field animate for selection from the props. Now just before we return the view for this player box component, we will call this function apply animation if needed. Now let's define this function. Now inside this function, we will call a function setInterval that will call a function after every 400 milliseconds. And inside this function, we need to change the background color of the piece. So right now in this condition, we are using the color from the props, but for animation we need to change its value after every 400 millisecond. So let's define a variable background color. Using react.useState. And the initial value is going to be the color of from the props. And now we will use this background color instead of the prop color. So we are going to be changing this background color in this function. So the background color is going to be either the color of the prop or it's going to be a white color. So each time this function is called, we need a way to decide whether to set the background color to the prop or to the white color. So for that purpose, let's define a variable. So each time this function is called, we increment this. And if it's an even number, according to this condition, it's going to set the background color to the color that was passed in the prop. Otherwise, it's going to be a white color. Now this function apply animation if needed will get called each time the player box gets rendered. But we don't want to set interval each time this function gets called. So we will call this function if this is true, animate for selection. So we will set interval if this is true, but we also need to clear this interval if this is false. So to clear this interval, we need a reference to this interval that will be returned by this function. So let's define a variable, interval ID. Initialize this to undefined. And inside this condition, we will clear the interval. And just to make sure that we do not call the set interval more than once, let's define a Boolean field. And if it's not animating, and we will set this back to false in this condition. But before that, we will check if it is true. Now let's save this and see if the animation is working. And as you can see, it's animating. Now you might have realized that something is wrong with the player box component, and the problem is, even if you select any of the pieces, the position of the selected piece does not get updated, and the selected piece still remains in the home. So if I select this piece, let's see. The green player gets highlighted, indicated that it's the green player's turn, but the yellow player's piece is still at home. So let's debug to find out what the problem is. In order to debug the code, you need to press Command plus M. This brings the developer's menu, and you can select debug. This will open React Native Debugger in a new tab of Chrome. So to debug the code, you need to open the respective file from here, src, and we need to debug the game. So we will start with the function on piece selection. And we will set the breakpoint over here. Now let's start the game. Now if I select any of the piece, we can see that the breakpoint has stopped. Now let's move step by step. We can see we have two moves, 6 and a 1. So the condition is true. Moves.length is greater than 1. The selected position equals to home. We can see that the position is updating to y1. Now we are going to update the state. And after the state is updated, let's set a breakpoint over here as well. Now we have one move left, that is a 1. So the player does not have any option for move, and we are going to move the piece from y1 to y2 with this function. So let's set a breakpoint inside this function, move piece by position. As you can see, the position is y1 and the move is 1. So let's set a breakpoint over here. And here we will see the new position that is going to be set to the piece. As you can see, the new position is by 2. So the position of piece is updated to by 2, but it looks like something is wrong after this. So let's set a breakpoint in this function did get bonus with new position. According to the situation, this function should be returning false because the position does not match. As we expected, the problem is with this condition. Actually, this function is returning true. The function check if position matches existing piece is inside this function did get bonus. So because of this statement, return position matched, it's actually returning from the parent function did get bonus. So what we need to do is before calling this function, we should check this condition. So we need to change the order of these. So let's do it and then try to execute it. As you can see now, the selected piece has updated its position and now it's no more at home. But we still cannot see the selected piece in the cell box is because we have not completed our work on the cell box component, and we will do that in the next video.